What is up, guys, and welcome to my early review of the new comedy slasher film, Hell of a Summer. And this is a film that was co-written and directed by Finn Wolfhard and Billy Brick. Finn Wolfhard, a lot of you guys will know as one of the main stars of Stranger Things, as well as the two most recent It films, the two most recent Ghostbusters films. Kid's been everywhere over the last 7 or 8 years. And then you have Billy Brick, who I'm less familiar with, but I do recognize from a role in Ghostbusters Afterlife. So this is a film that they wrote and directed, and it played at TIFF back in 2023. It was eventually acquired by Neon and is just now coming out wide into theaters this Friday. But I was actually lucky enough to be invited by Neon out to one of the premieres. They were doing like this Hell of a Summer tour where about 4 or 5 different cities and different dates over this last couple of weeks, they were premiering the film and doing Q&As. And the last stop was in Atlanta, Georgia, which is about 4 hours away from me. So I figured, fuck it, that sounds fun. Let me go ahead and make the drive for that. And it was a really fun night. So even before I get into the film, the premiere was really cool. There wasn't as much going on outside of the theater as was advertised. I think that the Plaza Theater in Atlanta was just a lot smaller, so there wasn't as much of the axe throwing and the cornhole games that we saw advertised for a number of the other tour dates, but they were giving out t-shirts like this one right here. They had tents set up where you could spray fake blood onto your t-shirt. They, of course, had an intro and a Q&A by a few of the stars of the film, of course, being Finn Wolfhard and Billy Brick most notably. And it was a really neat theater as well. I've never been to this theater. It doesn't look like a whole lot from the outside. It looks like it's just a part of a strip mall, but you walk in and it's one of those really cool old school theaters where they got the old school projection system. It's not necessarily a newer form of seating, but there was a lot of leg room, so at least it wasn't an uncomfortable blast from the past going back to before we had all the reclining seats and all that stuff. And I got to meet a number of people. First and foremost, Elaine from Deep Red Perfect Blue, who you'll know on Instagram and TikTok, who I've met at the Overlook Film Festival and then saw her again at Fantastic Fest last year. Her and her husband was out there. Was not expecting to see them until she shouted my name, and all of a sudden I was like, oh, hey, it's Elaine. So it was cool to be able to hang out with them. At least I knew somebody pretty well there that we could kind of chat with and have a good time with. And then I met a number of people who are fans of the channel. I saw a 31 on 31 shirt out in the wild, which was pretty awesome, from somebody who was a Patreon member of mine. I actually met a couple more people that were just recognized me strictly as, you're the guy that I just saw bitching about the woman in the yard on the way over here. That's crazy. That's kind of been a recurring thing for me. Anytime I've made like some kind of a public appearance and a number of people suddenly recognize me, it's because I was just kind of going semi-viral for bitching about some movie. Last year it was Madam Web. This year it's the woman in the yard. And then most hilarious to me, and I can't get into too many details with this, but I was taking some B-roll footage and I was walking into the theater kind of filming a little bit of stuff to put into this video as well as a TikTok. And as I was walking in, I noticed that Finn Wolfhard and a couple others were being escorted out of the theater by somebody who was very clearly their security. And as I was walking in, I noticed this security guy kind of clock me. And I was like, oh, okay, he thinks I'm like a crazy fan. I better move out of the way. So I move out of the way. And as they pass me, the bodyguard goes, I watch your podcast. And I was like, that is fucking hilarious. That is cool. Later on, he sat down. We got to know each other a little bit. Very cool guy. Hopefully I'll run into him again. But very fun night. And so I tell you all of that, not only to just share my experience, but also to preface things as whenever you go and see a film at an event like this, whether it be at a film festival or a world premiere or something really cool and more intimate like this, you are having a little bit of a heightened experience. So keep that in mind as I get into things that I liked. And there are certain things that I did not like about Hell of a Summer. I had the best possible viewing experience for this film. So if you watch it in the theater by yourself or with a couple of other people, or if you eventually watch it at home on VOD, obviously your experience is going to be a little different than what I just did.
Thank you so much for coming. This is our last stop on the tour. We've been screening this all around the country, and it means so much that we can screen this film, especially here. It's a very special theater for all of us. This is my favorite theater. Last year when I shot here. I've lived here for a year and went every single week.
So Hell of a Summer is obviously a throwback movie to camp slasher films of the 80s, but even more so, it's like a coming of age comedy, and I'll elaborate a little bit more on that later, but it's basically telling the story of a group of young camp counselors who are getting this camp ready the night before all of the attendees, all of the kids are supposed to arrive, and a masked slasher starts to take them out one by one. Comedy horror has been doing fantastic so far in 2025. Of course, a lot of you guys know I love the good old-fashioned slasher movies. Even though I'm not the biggest Friday the 13th fan, I love a good camp slasher film. So there were so many things about this that absolutely had my attention, and I was pretty sure that I was at least going to enjoy this, but held out hope, especially with how bleak of a movie month March was. This might actually be a movie that I love. Starting off with the positives for Hell of a Summer, I really enjoyed the characters here. I think that they were very well written. I think that they're enjoyable personalities. Some of them kind of lend themselves to more caricatures and tropes of characters that you typically see in these types of movies, but they at least do something a little different with it, a little bit more modern with it. These are characters who are very much embodying Generation Z, and not in a obnoxious way. Like a lot of times in movies, these characters are used to heighten like how socially conscious and over the top that generation is compared to a lot of us older generations, but it doesn't really go for that angle. So it brings a nice little modern flavor to a set of characters that we have been seeing ever since maybe even the 70s. And I think a lot of the actors that are at play here are very fun. Of course, Finn Wolfhard, I've always enjoyed him ever since he was a little kid on Stranger Things. I've enjoyed him very much as Richie in It, and I was disappointed how minimally he was used in the last Ghostbusters film. So he's somebody I've always liked. I enjoyed his character. I really enjoyed his back and forth with Billy Brick, who, as I said, I don't have as much experience with, but him specifically as a character is kind of one of the co-leads of this movie. I think the Jason character, aptly named, is more of the focus, played by Fred Hessinger, and he's a lot of fun too. But Billy Brick's character, there was something about his personality where he's almost like that guy in Friday the 13th Part 4, the guy that brings up the dead fuck, where it's like everybody else is getting laid but him, and he very much wears that on his sleeve as an annoyance. He's kind of that character here to a much less obnoxious degree, and so I just kind of enjoyed some of the natural comedy of his character arc, about his personality. And then, as I was already talking about, Fred Hessinger's character, Jason, who is the older guy who kind of puts himself in charge, like he's the camp leader, and they all keep reminding him that position doesn't even exist, bro. And so he's a very fun character because he's an older guy trapped very much in like a kid's mentality. And so he's hanging out with all these younger people that he really doesn't click with, really doesn't gel with. And there's a lot of natural comedy that comes from that. The older guy that never could quite grow up.
How many summers does a guy get to spend here?
A lot, apparently.
I also really liked the music, more specifically the score of this film. No, most of the times when things are throwing back to the 80s or being set in the 80s, they tend to go very heavy with the synth style, which I love, but I like the fact that this movie kind of goes for more of like the grindhouse 80s vibe. And you'll know what I mean whenever you hear it, but it doesn't really have that flavor of like almost a stereotypical 80s score or a stereotypical 80s throwback score. It's very much going much more for the lower budget films that we saw in the 80s with the tones and the musical notes. And I thought that it lent itself well to the tone of the movie, and also was just a welcome change of pace from all the other scores we tend to see with movies like this. One of the bigger takeaways that I got from this is, despite some of its shortcomings that I will certainly get into soon, I think this is a really nice intro to what Finn Wolfhard and Billy Brick's collaborations may look like in the future. It shows a lot of room for growth. They do a good job as directors at very much having a modern look to the film, but also achieving a very throwback vibe to it with the way that they direct some of the kill scenes and some of the scenes with the killer in the shadows, or, just showing elements of the killer, kind of keeping that whole 80s vibe of the Friday the 13th movies and movies where there's a masked reveal by the third act. So I think they have a lot of talent as writers and directors, and this was a very good first effort. I'm excited to see what they do in the future. Moving on to the mixed, while this is not a heavy element in the film, and I'm glad for that because I don't think every movie needs to have such a focus on a theme or a message or a social commentary, there's obviously something at play that they're discussing here as far as modern society and having a very Gen Z cast of characters, and even just the dynamic between the older character who's hanging out with all these younger kids and just doesn't mesh. There's something there, but I don't think there was anything particularly interesting or profound or clever about what they were saying. It was very just kind of surface level observations. So I don't even know if it really needed to be in there. I think the cast was fun just for having that generational dynamic. Any kind of discussion deeper than that didn't really go anywhere in the film for me. And now moving on to the negatives. And the big one here that I think is going to be this movie's potential downfall is that I think it is being horrifically mismarketed. This is 90% coming of age summer comedy and only 10% slasher horror film. And I say that because even though the slasher element is very much the backdrop and the overall plot of the film, there's not a whole lot of focus on what's going on the actual slashing or a whole lot of effort put into the killer's eventual reveals or anything. That is all very much the afterthought in this film, whereas all of the comedic situations and the back and forth and the dialogue between the characters and that very much of coming of age through this situation, that is obviously where a lot of the inspiration from this film came from and their main point for doing it. And that was only confirmed by the Q&A when they only really were talking about the coming of age stuff. At no point did they ever talk about their influences from 80s slashers or their favorite horror movies or any of that. They only talked about coming of age comedies. And so that was kind of like the writing on the wall for me, confirming a little bit of what I was already thinking after seeing the film, which is the slasher element is not the point here. And unfortunately, all of the marketing from the poster to the trailer to even like the theme of this little tour that they're doing, it's leaning much harder on the horror and the slasher elements and is really trying to draw in that crowd. And while I think a lot of horror and a lot of slasher fans are going to have fun with this film, I do think a lot of them are also going to be very let down and very much feeling like they were sold a bill of goods that they did not actually get when they sit down to watch this film. I think if you walk in knowing that this is predominantly a coming-of-age film that has some slasher elements sprinkled in, you'll be better set off and much more prone to enjoying this. But if you walk in expecting this to be a true throwback to 80s slashers and you're expecting carnage candy and badass kills and tension and some jump scares and a great killer with an iconic look and some interesting reveals by the end of it, you're not really getting a whole lot of that here.
Everybody, join hands together. We're gonna bless the board.
I don't fuck with ghost shit.
Do you fuck with getting brutally murdered outside?
And unpacking those things a little more specifically, I was most frustrated with the amount of off-screen kills that are in this film. And from the few people that I talked with after this film, and even people that saw it at previous dates in this little hell of a summer tour, that is the one thing that everybody pretty much agreed on was I went there for the slashing and the bashing, and it was mostly all off-screen stuff. Now, it's among the more entertaining version of off-screen stuff because of some of the comedic setup of what they're doing, but the 80s slasher crowd does not like off-screen kills. That is almost like the antithesis of what those people go to these movies for. And so if you're going to this movie for the carnage candy, you do get some. You get a couple of good kills in the beginning. You get one gory moment towards the end of the film, but the majority of the middle of the film is pretty much all off-screen kills where you just get a suggestion of what happened or you see the aftermath. And I don't think that's going to be satisfying for horror fans, more predominantly the ones that love the movies that this is paying homage to. And the shame is the couple of on-screen kills that we get are very good. Like they're ones that start off the film are very funny, very entertaining, and got me excited for the type of film I thought I was going to be watching. And there is one more kill, as I've said later on in the film, where they have a pretty good gore effect. And that almost made me a bit more frustrated at the kills and the number of them specifically that are off screen, because clearly they can do a good job when they want to show it. Just why they chose not to, I wish somebody would have asked that in the Q&A. I wish there was more time for me to ask that in the Q&A, because that was the one burning question that I had. Yo, Where the fuck's the carded candy? And moving on from that, I also was not very enamored with the overall reveal of the killer, both identity and motivation. And that seems to be the one thing that I think modern slashers struggle with the most, at least for me personally, because most of the ones I watch nowadays, whether it's Thanksgiving or Heart Eyes or this, that tends to be something that just really doesn't land by the end of it. And this is one where, you get to the end, you get to these reveals, and it very much could have been a saving grace with a film like this where, the slasher fan in me was very much needing a little bit more from that element of the film. If we could have had a really cool reveal, a nice little twist, or something even that's just really comedically smart in the way that it was executed, it could have made up for a lot of that. But unfortunately, I found it to be one of the weakest elements of the film, which again, just kind of lends itself to my understanding that the coming of age comedy and the comedic dynamic of the characters, that's the strength here. That was the passion. That's where the inspiration all was. And all of the classic slasher elements were just kind of afterthoughts. Only other thing that I would say, and this was not like a huge gripe, but I did find the lighting to be a little bit of an issue in this movie. Not a detrimental one, but for something that's going for a slasher film that's mostly taking place at night, I found a number of sequences, even a number of, reveals of these off-screen kills, which again, might just have been a budgetary restriction decision, like where we don't have enough to really make this look awesome, so we need to keep it in shadows as much as possible. That's certainly something I could accept, but there was a number of sequences here where I wanted it to be brightened up just a little bit more, just so I could see what the hell is going on a little bit better. Overall, guys, I had a good time with this film. I enjoyed it. I certainly would not mind watching it again. And I think if you walk in knowing that this is not a slasher film first, it is very much a coming-of-age comedy first, I think there's a good chance that a lot of you will enjoy it just as much as I did. I just wish they would have found a way to balance both of those elements of this film and appeal to both sides of that audience base a little bit better, especially with how heavily they're marketing this to 80s slasher fans. Well, that's it for this one, guys. If you enjoyed that, please click over here for all of my 2025 new release reviews. I'm also going to put my South by Southwest ranking if you want to check out 24 films and TV shows to keep your eyes out for. Like, share, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss everything in the future. And as always, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean you have to be.